Border restrictions and lockdowns have dominated the week in politics, and for a breakdown of all the issues, it is time for our political panel. Gideon Rozner, the Director of Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs, and Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, join me live now. Thank you both for joining me. Gideon, I'll start with you. Victoria has eased restrictions today. We no longer have to wear masks outside as of tomorrow. The Premier has announced that there would be a return to the office, but it's quite a slow return. Only 25% of people will be able to work in offices. What do you make of that?
Well, look, as usual, it's reopening too slowly. It's dragging out this pain needlessly. Look, not being able, working in the office as opposed to working at home over Zoom is small fry in the scheme of things and isn't anywhere near as bad as some people in Victoria have had it. But I know plenty of people, indeed people I work with, who've struggled to work at home. They miss the adrenaline and the camaraderie of the office. They do feel isolated. So, look, it would be great to see that being sped up. But as far as the other restrictions easing, I make the point again, it's great for the hospitality business and staff that have really suffered under these lockdowns. But, Gabriella, I can't get too excited about this. I cannot get excited about the fact that freedoms that we took for granted just a year ago or less are now being drip-fed to us, especially because the Premier is taking credit for it and is being made out as some sort of hero for it. And when I look at what happened in South Australia, I just don't trust this to last. I don't trust the government not to wet the bed over a cluster or a minor outbreak in cases sometime down the track. So, look, better than nothing, better than what we had before, I suppose. But, look, it's still a terrible situation, and I would argue a needless one.
It's interesting you mentioned South Australia. On Friday, I was speaking to people in Melbourne and about their response to what's happened in South Australia, and they were saying that they understand because people just don't want to have what we had here in Melbourne. They don't want a lockdown that goes for 3.5 months. Ebony, what's your response to what the Premier announced today in terms of winding back those restrictions? Do you think he's gone far enough?
Yeah, I think, it is really hard to judge. Obviously, there's people in the community like Gideon that think it should go faster, and people who want to be cautious because they don't want to be locked down for months on end again. So I think it is really hard, and there's probably no right answer. But at the end of the day, I think these can't just be questions of expertise, but they also need to be democratic questions, and the Andrews government has to be accountable and transparent for those types of decisions. But look at how quickly Victoria's second wave got out of control. At the end of the day, this global pandemic started with one infected person, and until we have a reliable vaccine, all that we have to stop the spread of this virus, which it spreads incredibly easily, is social distancing, mask wearing, and the types of restrictions that we have seen. They must be reasonable, and I think the community needs them to be justified. But I think both Victoria and South Australia show the community is willing to do the right thing and to take these kind of restrictions when they can see a reasonable need for it. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there. South Australians were quite happy with the idea of a short, sharp lockdown because they didn't want to go down that path of Victoria where things got out of control and they're locked down for months. So hopefully things can continue to ease in the lead up to Christmas, because I know that'll make everyone extremely happy.
Yeah, and it is certainly good news that Victoria has recorded 23 days in a row of no new cases. But Gideon, do you think this shows that the strategy all along from the government was elimination? And Professor Brett Sutton was very careful not to use that word today, or he said, to quote him, he said that elimination might not be the right word, but in just 5 days' time, the virus will be eliminated from Victoria.
Look, it's become very clear that what the governments have been pursuing across Australia, not just in Victoria, although that's the worst case of it, is a de facto elimination strategy. I remember at the beginning, what seems like a lifetime ago, but is around 6 months ago, when the idea was to flatten the curve, and that was on the ostensibly reasonable, which is to let the virus run through the community at a rate that our hospitals could keep up with. By all accounts, we absolutely did that, both by, as Ebony said, look, early restrictions which could have been justified in the earlier days, but certainly not now, and by bolstering our hospital system and installing new ventilators and building new ICU beds. By any account, our hospital is well equipped to take care of the cases that unfortunately deal badly with this virus, who are, arguably or the evidence shows, in the minority. And we could have had a more targeted strategy where we do encourage mask wearing. I'm still not sure about making it mandatory. We do encourage social distancing. We do rely on businesses to do the right thing, because no business wants to be responsible for an outbreak for commercial and moral and reputational reasons. And most importantly of all, we protect the elderly and the vulnerable. What we spent on JobKeeper in this country could have been spent on the world's best and biggest Meals on Wheels service to make sure people who had to isolate because of autoimmune deficiency or old age or anything else had access to absolutely everything they needed and wanted. Instead of having the army knock on the doors to make sure that people weren't having people over, we could have had the army delivering care packages to the most vulnerable people in our communities. We didn't take that road. We took a different one, but I hope it's not too late to change tack. But again, I make the point, I just don't trust our contact tracing system, which you of all people know, Gabriella, through your excellent work on this and your work in those terrible press conferences, is not up to scratch, and I don't think can prevent a third wave, God forbid, from occurring here in Victoria.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Gideon. It's also interesting that the government here in Victoria have announced that now venues must use QR codes in order to take advantage of restrictions. It was just a few weeks ago we were told that pen and paper was really the best way. Evany, look, what do you make of how the government has handled this here in Victoria? Do you think they should have been more transparent, that maybe elimination was the strategy they were going for rather than suppression?
Well, Gideon's talking about that idea of flattening the curve, which I always thought initially was just so that things don't get out of control. And of course, if we just let the virus rip, it could be that we can keep the number of cases low enough so that they don't overwhelm, our intensive care units and the number of respirators we have. But I'm just not sure that the Australian community is comfortable with letting that number of Australians die. Because this virus is lethal to a certain number of people, not a huge number, but enough. We can see 250,000 dead Americans in the United States, where they have let the virus rip through the community. It has yet to overwhelm a lot of the health systems in the United States, but very early on, we saw mass burials in New York City because things very quickly got out of control. So, I do think it's important to have these debates, about the right way to go. But I do think it is important when we're talking about a strategy of just flattening the curve, that inevitably means just letting a number of Australians die. That's effectively what we're talking about. And I'm not sure, because Australia did such a good job of getting this under control in the first place, that's entirely a direction which we're comfortable taking. But I just want to come back to the faults that we saw in the quarantine hotel system in Victoria, because I think we have seen some of those same flaws emerge in South Australia. And the number one thing there is insecure work. These are people in hotel quarantine. That's a workforce that is protecting the entire Australian community from this virus escaping from people returning from overseas and elsewhere. They should be in secure work and paid adequately, that they feel like they can test, be upfront with contact tracers, and don't need to work in multiple workplaces. Why can't we do that? It's something that people flagged right from the beginning, that insecure work was a way that this virus was going to transmit through the community. We saw it in Victoria. We've seen it again in South Australia. People working in these critical jobs who can't make ends meet on that security work that they're doing, and then end up transmitting the virus through the community because they have to put food on the table. It's unacceptable. And if we're worried about the cost of lockdowns, well, how cheap is it to just pay people a decent wage and give them paid leave?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Brendan O'Connor has come out today pushing for more hotel quarantine employees to get paid more money. Gideon, I just want to go back to South Australia. I want to get your reaction to the backflip, but also Victoria still has its border closed to South Australia. What do you make of that, considering that the lockdown there was so short-lived? They're now out of lockdown, and it seems they've got the virus under control.
Well, just on the borders, look, I think this is just premiers unfortunately have been rewarded in terms of polls and indeed election results with, strong borders within states. obviously it's a betrayal of in my view, it's a betrayal of federation. And in my view, it's quite likely unconstitutional rather. But look, the South Australian story again is just a terrible story because while the lockdown only lasted a few days, it was a mistake by government that drove businesses to throw out hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of fresh food that, which isn't just an economic issue, but is really a shame when you think of people in this country who could have enjoyed that food and the fact that, we want to be a society where people have enough to eat. But look, the other point I can make is I've seen some awful trolling of that Woodville pizza bar on social media and a lot of really, really ordinary behaviour from people and anger directed at that bar now at that restaurant. Now, as far as I'm aware, there is no evidence that the restaurant owners lied to anybody, lied to any contact tracers. There's no evidence it was their fault. I think that businesses have done it so tough through this. It's really unfair to take out people's anger on any small business unless there's a very good reason. And I'll be in Adelaide over Christmas, New Year, and I will proudly go to the Woodville Pizza Bar and leave a tip big enough to fund JobKeeper for another 10 years. And I encourage everybody in South Australia who wants to give business a fair go to join me, because I don't want to see somebody who's already struggled under lockdowns suffering for no good reason.
Yeah, it's interesting. There has been a lot of blame on that person for lying to contact tracers, and I suppose that person isn't the one who decided to put the whole state into a hard, extreme lockdown. We're almost out of time, but Ebony, really quickly, what's your response to what Gideon just said and also the borders?
Yeah, look, I think Gideon's right about border closures being popular. Surprise, surprise. I think people like to feel safe. But the other thing is I completely agree with, I think it's really distressing to see the massive community backlash to that one small business and that one particular person who wasn't upfront with the contact tracers. What we really need is to encourage people, if they have symptoms, to go and get tested, to isolate if they need to. And we're not going to have people feeling particularly wanting to cooperate with contact tracers if they know that they have massive public opprobrium and denigration coming their way for things like this. It's not the way to encourage the community to do the right thing. But again, come back to that idea of we have to fix this problem of insecure work in the community. It's a huge weakness in opening up our economy and keeping things going and trusting our contact tracing system to manage cases where we do have outbreaks, which is inevitable. But we're always going to see these weaknesses in the system while people who are in casual or part-time work don't have leave and don't have the means of support to put food on the table if they have to go into isolation or quarantine. So it is something the government still has done nothing about and will have to fix if we are going to open up like Gideon wants to and let the virus go through the community. We certainly can't do it without being able to stay on top of cases like that and make sure people cooperate.
Look, we're just out of time. Gideon Rozner and Ebony Bennett, thank you both so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ebony.